South Carolina, where after the Civil War, black people owned most of this. But over the decades, the land was lost. And to this day, we got black folks that are still fighting to keep their little piece of the American dream. By 1910, African Americans owned around 16 million acres of land, much of it acquired through purchases and homesteading. But after years of violence, intimidation, and legal trickery, most of it was taken. Texas A&M law professor Thomas Mitchell has been tracking that loss for 2 decades.
Historically, if we're talking about African Americans, despite this incredible acquisition of land after the Civil War, most of that property was not considered prime real estate. For example, Hilton Head, South Carolina. Until 1950, Hilton Head was remote. There wasn't a bridge from the South Carolina mainland out to Hilton Head Island, and the island was owned by majority African Americans.
Right.
What does South Carolina do? They build a bridge. Real estate developers realize, oh, there's a great economic opportunity, and they have divisions of what has become Hilton Head.
The vulnerability of black land isn't limited to the coastlines. It's widespread throughout the United States. Heirs property. On the most basic level, what is it?
Heirs property is communal type property where your ancestors would have purchased the land, and once they passed away, it transfers to the next generation and their descendants. It's fractional ownership. A property that could be owned by 200 people. Any one of those heirs could sell their percentage. That new owner can go to the court and say, well, we can't agree on how to manage this land.
And force the rest of the folk to sell it even if they don't want to?
Yes. And so it was essential for us to move it out of heirs property status. And that process costs from probate to title clearing close to about $10,000.
Wait, so you own the land, but then you had to pay $10,000 to own the land again?
Exactly. Because of the cost, a lot of families don't clear title to their property. And so then it keeps them in a vulnerable economic risk position.
African Americans disproportionately own heirs property that every lawyer who was knowledgeable about this ownership form would tell them, run away. Do not ever own it under this structure. And so you're having a population sitting in this very vulnerable way, and oftentimes in a way that they don't understand how the law operates, sometimes until a lawsuit is filed.
As part of the legal process, the forced sale of heirs property has to be publicly announced. In the Lewis's situation, a local newspaper posted a notice in the weeks leading up to the auction. To developers, what's the mechanism that they use to track down family members?
Okay, they'll come into this office, and then generally you know the piece of property that you're looking for. You know, whether that is because it's got some timber on it or something of that nature. Then what you do is you can look at the tax assessor's office, and the tax assessor's office will give you just a visual plat, a hand-drawn plat of how the property went from one person to the next person to the next person, and that's how they'll initially find out who owns the property.
So what happened with the Lewises?
The Lewises are a family that is spread out across the United States. So James Terry Tuggle buys into that property. Now, he didn't just buy a sliver of that property. He ended up buying somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%.
Understood.
Once he owns that, he can force the entire thing to be sold.
And that's what he did.
Which he did.
I smell it. Over the course of a decade, Tuggle, a timber developer in town, bought the shares of more than 20 people connected to the Lewis property, most of them from out of state.
Sale happens at the sheriff's office, where it is publicly open for bid, and it's sold for $555,000.
And a bargain of a price, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know, $550,000.
For 500 acres?
Oh, I've seen 17 acres of land sold for $1,800. And believe me, that, that's disturbing.
The sale he's talking about was made in 2001 to a real estate investor named James Steele, who advertises his ability to force the sale of heirs property. We caught up with him at a sheriff's auction nearby. How does heirs property fit into your overall business model?
To be truthful with it, it's probably 90% of my business model. Even going back to the Civil War, we're doing something that the people in the Civil War had it. I mean, they were slaves, and they had it. And I've had other landowners come to me and say, well, would you file a lawsuit for me and do this? Because I don't want to be the bad guy. People are sincere about not wanting to sell. They mean it. Most don't. Most say that, but they don't mean it. They just want instant gratification and money now. But there are some that don't want to sell, and it's usually the ones that live on the property that are getting free rent, free everything.
It's their land. That's not free rent.
Well, they only own a minuscule portion of it. I've heard it thousands of times. You can't make me sell my land. And then I respond back. I said, yes, I can.
The bottom line is what you have is these families who many times owned property for generations, including families who acquired ownership right after the end of the Civil War. Their property rights are instantaneously extinguished, and then they are stripped of a significant amount of their overall wealth, not just their real estate wealth, because African Americans disproportionately who have assets, it's represented in land and homes. So their single greatest asset now has been sold at a fire sale, and they're getting pennies on the dollar.
Seems like it disproportionately affects African Americans who, through legal trickery and threats of violence and lynching and whatnot, land has been taken from them.
There are certain things just because you're black or you're Asian or you what?
You going after the
land. So if everybody in the world could sell a piece of land to their brother or their sister or their son, and nobody could build factories, nobody could do anything. It would always be out of commerce and never be able to use. There's no remedy to get it back into commerce. And
do you think it's fair?
It has to be. It has to be fair.
The reason we have in the African American community such a high incidence of heirs property is that when African Americans moved from the status of being property themselves to after the Civil War, being able to become landowners,
right,
hardly any of these families were able to structure the ownership in a way that would be stable because most African American families had no access to attorneys. And there's studies in various southern states that show that it's somewhere between 10 and 40% of all property African Americans own is heirs property, because a huge percentage of these families don't have wills or estate plans. And what they know is their property transfers to their heirs. There's a huge racial will-making or estate planning gap. Average white family has 10 times the assets of the average black family. Real estate developers or speculators or investors, they know that. And so what they do is they give a lowball price because they know that the family can't even compete against the lowball price.
According to United States Forest Service research, there's around $28 billion worth of heirs property in the South, and that's a conservative estimate. Thomas Mitchell drafted legislation designed to help families hold on to theirs. So far, it's passed in 16 states.
So the first provision is if somebody files one of these lawsuits and requests a court to order the forced sale of the property, what the other owners are then entitled to is to buy out the person who asked for the forced sale. There had been this narrative that black landowners were inevitably going to be extinct by about now. I was like, why are we going to sit back and watch more and more property and land and homes go, and then on the back end call for reparations, as opposed to trying to stabilize the ownership so that it's not dissipated 20 or 30 years from now?